I always thought I was living the dream. A beautiful home, a successful family business, 2 incredible teenage daughters and my wife, Beth, who was the glue that held us all together. My brother John and I had spent the last 15 years growing the electrical company my dad started, turning it into one of the most respected businesses in the state. It was worth over $20 million now, a legacy I was proud of. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine and it was good. Until that Friday. The call came around 10:30 a.m. Beth never called during work hours unless it was urgent. Her voice was sharp and panicked. "James, you need to come home now." "What's wrong?" I asked, heart pounding. "Are the girls okay?" "They're fine. Just, please come home." "It's serious?" I didn't waste time asking questions. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios as I drove: an accident, a break-in, some kind of emergency with the girls. What I wasn't prepared for was the scene waiting for me. Pulling into the driveway, I saw a moving truck parked outside. Workers were hauling out our furniture. The dining table where we celebrated birthdays, the couch where we watched movies, even the antique grandfather clock that had been in my family for generations. Standing beside her car, the one I bought her just last year, was Beth. She was dressed impeccably, not a hair out of place, as if she were going to lunch with friends instead of watching our life being dismantled. "What's going on?" I demanded, slamming the car door and walking up to her. "Beth, what is this?" She didn't flinch, didn't show a shred of remorse. Instead, she handed me a thick envelope. "It's divorce papers, James," she said, her voice cool and detached. "I've fallen out of love. I'm leaving." For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, staring at the papers. "You're leaving?" I repeated, like the words didn't make sense. "What about the girls? What about us?" "They'll understand eventually," she said, crossing her arms. "I've been unhappy for years and I've met someone else. I need to do this for myself." "Someone else?" The words barely came out. My stomach churned as 1,000 questions flooded my mind. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand answers. But before I could say another word, one of the movers interrupted. "Ma'am, where do you want the boxes, from the bedroom?" Beth turned to him with a polite smile, like we weren't in the middle of a bombshell moment. "The new address, of course," she replied casually. It hit me then, she wasn't just leaving. She'd planned this. Every detail. This wasn't a decision made overnight. It was calculated, deliberate, and cold. I grabbed the divorce papers and flipped through them, hoping this was some cruel joke. "You didn't even talk to me about this. What about the girls? Did you even tell them?" Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, but she quickly masked it. "They'll be fine," she said, brushing me off. "They're old enough to understand." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Beth, they're teenagers. This will destroy them. And you're just packing up and walking out?" "For who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she climbed into the car and started the engine. "I need to go." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, James." I stood there, frozen, as she drove off. It wasn't until the truck pulled away that I realized the movers had left the delivery address on one of the boxes. My stomach sank as I read it. It was John's address. My brother. I drove straight to John's place. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they ached, but I barely noticed. My mind was spinning. Beth leaving was bad enough, but the address? It couldn't mean what I thought it did. It couldn't. John's house was in the newer part of town, just 15 minutes from ours. I'd been there countless times over the years for cookouts, holidays, family get-togethers. It felt surreal pulling into his driveway that day, not as a brother but as someone chasing answers. When I got out, I spotted Beth's car parked neatly in front of his garage. That was all the confirmation I needed. My heart pounded as I stormed up to the front door, but I hesitated for a second before knocking. What would I even say? What could I say? Before I could decide, the door swung open. There he was, John, my younger brother, my business partner, and apparently my wife's someone else. He froze when he saw me, the color draining from his face. "James," he stammered, his voice tight. "I didn't expect you." "Clearly," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Where is she?" He didn't answer, just glanced over his shoulder. That's when Beth appeared, standing at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed. She looked different somehow, colder, harder. "Beth?" My voice cracked. "You left me for him?" She didn't even flinch. "Yes, James," she said flatly. "I didn't want to lie to you anymore." "Lie to me?" I spat. "How long has this been going on?" John finally spoke up, stepping in front of her like he was trying to shield her. "Look, James, we didn't mean for it to happen. Don't you dare." I cut him off, jabbing a finger at him. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You're my brother, John. My brother." We built a life, a business, a family legacy together, and this, I gestured wildly between him and Beth, this is what you've been doing behind my back. Beth sighed like she was tired of the whole thing. James, we didn't plan this. It just happened. It just happened? I repeated, my voice rising. You think that makes it better? How long, Beth? How long have you been sneaking around with him? She hesitated, which was answer enough. A year, she finally said, not meeting my eyes. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. A year? I whispered. You've been lying to me for a year? James, John started again, we didn't mean to hurt you. Shut up. I snapped, rounding on him. You don't get to play the victim here, John. You're not just my brother, you're my business partner, for God's sake. How long have you been screwing me over in more ways than one? He opened his mouth but closed it again, clearly realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. I turned back to Beth, my voice breaking. And the girls? Did you think about them at all? Or were they just collateral damage in this little affair of yours? Beth's expression faltered for the first time, guilt flickering across her face. They'll understand eventually, she said quietly, but it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than me. Understand? I laughed bitterly. They'll understand that their mother and uncle stabbed their dad in the back? Yeah, I'm sure that'll go over great. I couldn't stand to look at either of them anymore. I turned on my heel and walked out, slamming the door behind me. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My wife and brother, two people I trusted most in the world, had destroyed my family in one fell swoop. The betrayal was a lead weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone think. But one thing was clear. If John wanted to destroy our family, he wasn't going to take our business down with it. First thing in the morning, I drove to the office. I got there before anyone else, which was exactly what I wanted. The quiet hum of the building, usually a comforting reminder of the life Dad built, now felt eerie. I went straight to John's office and waited. He showed up half an hour later, whistling like it was any other day. When he saw me sitting at his desk, his smile faltered. James, what are you doing here this early? Close the door, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, then obeyed, shutting the door behind him. Look, I know you're upset. Upset? I interrupted, standing up. Upset doesn't even begin to cover it, John. I want answers and I want them now. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I already told you we didn't mean for it to happen. It just... Stop, I snapped, slamming my hand on the desk. I don't want your excuses. What I want is for you to sell me your shares of the company. Today? That caught him off guard. Wait, what? James, let's not do anything rash. Rash? I barked out a bitter laugh. You slept with my wife for a year, John. I think we're past rash. If you think I'm going to keep working with you, keep building our legacy while you play house with Beth, you're delusional. His face went pale. James, we built this together. You can't just cut me out. Watch me, I said coldly. I'll buy you out at market value. You'll walk away with more money than you deserve, and I'll never have to see your face again. Seems like a fair trade. He shook his head, panic creeping into his voice. James, come on. This is Dad's company. Don't you dare bring Dad into this, I growled, stepping closer. You've already tarnished his memory by dragging our family through the mud. Don't use him to save your skin now. John was silent, staring at the floor. For a moment I thought he might actually agree. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening. I'm not selling, he said firmly. I'm not walking away from what we built. You can't force me out. Oh, I can, I shot back. And I will. I pulled out my phone and dialed. John's eyes widened as I put the call on speaker. Mom? I said when she picked up. You're on speakerphone with John and me. I need you to hear something. James? What's going on? She asked, confused. John's been sleeping with Beth, I said bluntly. For a year. I just thought you should know what kind of man your younger son really is. There was silence on the other end, and then, John? Is this true? He looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Mom, Answer me, she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. Yes, he admitted, barely audible. She let out a shaky breath. James, do whatever you need to do. You have my blessing. I hung up without another word and turned back to John. You have until the end of the day to sign the buyout papers, I said, my voice deadly calm. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone, our employees, our clients, our friends, knows exactly who you are. John stared at me, a mix of anger and fear in his eyes. But he didn't argue. He knew he was beaten up by the time I got home, I felt like I'd aged a decade in just 2 days. The confrontation with John had drained what little energy I had left, but there was still one thing I couldn't avoid: the girls. They deserved to know the truth, or at least as much of it as I could manage. They were waiting for me in the living room when I walked in. Sarah, 16, was curled up on the couch scrolling through her phone, and Emily, 14, was sprawled on the floor flipping through a magazine. They both looked up when I entered, their faces lighting up briefly before they noticed how exhausted I looked. "Dad? What's going on?" Sarah asked, sitting up straighter. "Is Mom okay?" Emily chimed in, worry flickering across her face. I sat down heavily on the armchair and rubbed my hands over my face, trying to figure out where to even begin. "Your mom," I started, then stopped, the words catching in my throat. "Is she sick?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with panic. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. "She's not sick. She's leaving." The room went completely silent. Sarah's phone slipped from her hand and landed on the couch with a soft thud. Emily stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "Leaving?" Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" "She's decided she doesn't want to be part of this family anymore," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She's with someone else now." I couldn't bring myself to say who. "Not yet." "Someone else?" Sarah's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Who?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. They were old enough to know the truth, but how could I tell them that their mother had betrayed not just me but the whole family? That she'd chosen their uncle over us? "It's Uncle John," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Both girls stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. For a moment they didn't say anything. Then Emily shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she said firmly. "No, that's not true. You're lying." "I wish I were," I said, my own voice breaking. "I wish I could tell you this was all some kind of mistake, but it's not." Sarah stood up abruptly, her face pale. "She left us for Uncle John," she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How could she do that? How could she just leave?" "I don't know," I admitted, my shoulders sagging. "I've been asking myself the same thing." Emily burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. I moved to sit next to her, pulling her into a hug as she sobbed against my chest. Sarah stayed standing, her fists clenched at her sides, anger and hurt written all over her face. "Does she even care about us?" Sarah demanded. "Or was this just about her?" "She loves you," I said automatically, but the words felt hollow. Did she? How could she claim to love them and still do this? Then why didn't she tell us? Sarah shot back. Why didn't she even say goodbye? I didn't have an answer for that. All I could do was hold Emily tighter and hope that somehow we would get through this together. The next few days were a whirlwind of lawyers, paperwork, and hard conversations. I had no choice but to face the cold, unrelenting machinery of divorce. Beth wasn't just leaving me, she was determined to take a significant chunk of everything I had worked for. The lawyer's office was sterile, the kind of place that made you feel small. My attorney, Mark, was an old friend of Dad's, a no-nonsense kind of guy with a reputation for getting results. As I sat across from him, he scanned the divorce papers Beth had served me, shaking his head. "She's asking for half of everything," he said, setting the papers down. "That includes your shares of the business." I clenched my jaw. "She doesn't get my shares," I said firmly. "She didn't build the company, I did." Mark nodded. "I agree, but the court might not see it that way. Your marriage lasted 17 years, James. That makes it a long-term union in the eyes of the law. A judge could easily decide she's entitled to half your assets." I felt my stomach churn. The idea of Beth getting her hands on the business, my dad's legacy, was unbearable. "What are my options?" I asked, gripping the edge of the desk. Mark leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We can fight this, but it's going to get messy. If she digs her heels in, you could be looking at years of litigation." "Then we fight," I said, my voice hard. "She's not taking what Dad and I built." Mark gave me a long, measured look. "Are you sure, James? This isn't just about money. It's about time, stress, and your daughters. The longer this drags out, the harder it's going to be on them." That gave me pause. The girls had been through enough already. Sarah was barely speaking to anyone, and Emily cried herself to sleep every night. The thought of putting them through more made my chest ache, but what was the alternative? Roll over and let Beth and John win? "Let's see what her lawyer says," I said finally. "If there's a way to settle this without giving up the company, I'll consider it. But I'm not handing her the keys to my life." Mark nodded. "I'll get started. In the meantime, you should prepare yourself. Divorce has a way of bringing out the worst in people. When I got home that evening, the girls were waiting for me at the kitchen table. Sarah had made dinner, spaghetti, one of the few things she knew how to cook. It was a little overcooked, but I didn't care. Seeing her trying to hold things together warmed something in me that had been frozen since that Friday morning. "We wanted to help," Emily said softly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You've been doing everything." I sat down between them, forcing a smile. "Thank you," I said. "This means a lot." We ate in relative silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" I set my fork down, looking between them. "We're going to be okay," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "It's going to take some time, but we're going to figure this out together." "What about Mom?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is she coming back?" I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "She's made her choice." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes again, but this time she wiped them away quickly. "We don't need her," she said fiercely, surprising me. "We have you." Her words hit me like a freight train, and for the first time in days I felt a spark of hope. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "We've got each other." A week later, I got a call from Mark asking me to come to his office. He sounded cautious, like he didn't want to get my hopes up too soon. When I arrived, he handed me a folder with a single piece of paper inside. "This just came in from Beth's lawyer," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Take a look." I skimmed the document, my eyes narrowing as I read the details. Beth was proposing a settlement. She would waive her claim to the business and its assets in exchange for a one-time cash payment and the house. "What's the catch?" I asked, handing the paper back to him. Mark nodded like he'd been expecting the question. "The cash payment is steep. She's asking for $2.5 million. And she wants to finalize this within 30 days. That's fast, especially for a divorce involving this kind of money." I stared at him, my mind racing. The business was worth much more than $2.5 million, but that money wasn't just sitting in my pocket. Most of it was tied up in assets, accounts, and day-to-day operations. Liquidating that kind of cash in such a short time would be nearly impossible without serious consequences for the company. "Can we negotiate?" I asked. Mark shrugged. "We can try, but my gut says she'll dig her heels in. She knows how much the company means to you. She's counting on you being willing to pay the price to protect it." "Of course she is," I muttered, the bitterness in my voice surprising even me. Mark leaned forward, his tone softening. "James, I know this is hard, but it might be worth considering. Fighting her in court could cost you more than $2.5 million in legal fees and lost time. And that's before we even get to the emotional toll." I leaned back in the chair, running a hand through my hair. The thought of giving Beth a single penny, let alone millions, felt like swallowing glass. But Mark was right. Dragging this out could do more damage to everyone involved, especially the girls. "I need time to think about it," I said finally. Mark nodded. "Take the weekend. But we'll need to respond soon." That night, I sat down with Sarah and Emily after dinner. I hadn't told them much about the divorce proceedings, but this was too big a decision to make without considering how it would affect them. "I need to talk to you both about something," I began, my voice heavy. They exchanged nervous glances but stayed quiet, waiting for me to continue. "Your mom has made an offer," I said, choosing my words carefully. "She's willing to give up her claim to the business, but she wants the house and a large sum of money in return." Emily frowned. "The house? But that's our home." "I know," I said gently. "But it's just a building, Emily. What makes it a home is us, being together." Sarah folded her arms, her expression hard. "She's trying to buy her way out of being a mom. That's what this is, isn't it?" I didn't know how to answer that. "It's complicated," I said finally. "But what matters is what's best for us moving forward." Emily looked down, twisting her hands in her lap. "Would we have to move?" "Maybe," I admitted. "But if we do, I'll make sure it's somewhere nice. Somewhere we can start fresh." Sarah shook her head, her voice tight with anger. "She doesn't deserve the house or the money. She walked out on us, Dad. She doesn't care about us." "She's still your mother," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "That doesn't mean she deserves to win," Sarah shot back. I didn't have a response to that. Instead, I reached across the table and took her hand. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about finding a way to move forward. For us." By Sunday night, I had made up my mind. I called Mark first thing Monday morning and told him to accept the deal. It wasn't an easy decision, but dragging this fight out wasn't worth the toll it would take on the girls, or on me. Mark promised to move quickly, and within days the terms were finalized. Beth would get the house and $2.5 million in cash. In return, I would retain full ownership of the business and all related assets. There was no spousal support, no shared custody battles. She had made it clear she didn't want custody of Sarah and Emily, which stung more than I expected. I sat the girls down that evening to break the news. "We're going to be moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your mom will keep the house, but we'll find somewhere new. Somewhere better." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to leave, Dad. I love our house." "I know," I said softly, pulling her into a hug. "But we'll make our new place just as special, I promise." Sarah didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. "Figures," she said, her tone bitter. "She gets everything she wants, like always." "This isn't about her," I said firmly. "It's about us. Starting fresh." Sarah crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced. But she didn't argue further, and for now, that was the best I could hope for. Finding a new place was harder than I anticipated. The housing market was competitive, and I needed something affordable while still providing stability for the girls. After weeks of searching, I found a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't as big or as fancy as our old place, but it had a cozy charm that I hoped would feel like home eventually. The move was emotional. Packing up years of memories, sorting through the life we had built in that house. It was like peeling back layers of a wound that hadn't fully healed. Sarah and Emily helped as much as they could, but I could tell the reality of leaving was hitting them hard. The day we left, Emily asked if she could go upstairs one last time. I followed her and watched as she stood in her empty bedroom, her small frame dwarfed by the bare walls. "I'm going to miss this room," she whispered, her voice trembling. I crouched down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to miss it," I said gently. "But remember, the best parts of our life aren't tied to this house. They're tied to us." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and let me lead her back downstairs. Once we settled into the new house, I threw myself into creating a sense of normalcy for the girls. I painted their rooms in their favorite colors, let them pick out new furniture, and made sure we had family dinners every night, no matter how hectic things got. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the pain of Beth's betrayal felt unbearable, when the weight of raising 2 teenagers on my own seemed too heavy to carry. But then there were moments, Sarah helping Emily with her homework, both of them laughing over a dumb TV show, that reminded me why I had to keep going. The business was thriving, though it felt hollow without John. I hired a new operations manager to fill his role, someone with experience and no personal ties to complicate things. My employees rallied around me, offering their support in subtle but meaningful ways: a cup of coffee left on my desk, a kind word in the hallway. Bit by bit, life began to feel manageable again. It had been a little over 3 months since the dust settled. The girls and I were adjusting to our new routine, and the wound Beth and John had left was beginning to scab over. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. Then John showed up. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was outside trimming the hedges. Emily was at a friend's house, and Sarah was in the living room, earbuds in, half watching a movie while scrolling on her phone. I was enjoying the rare quiet when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I turned to see John stepping out of his old truck, looking hesitant and uncomfortable. He hadn't bothered to call or text, not that I'd have picked up. Just seeing him standing there brought all the anger and betrayal surging back. "What the hell are you doing here?" I barked, walking toward him, clippers still in hand. John raised his hands, palms out, like he was surrendering. "James, I just want to talk." "Talk?" I snapped. "You think there's anything left to talk about after what you did?" "Please," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Just give me 5 minutes." I stared at him, my grip tightening on the clippers. Part of me wanted to tell him to get lost, but another part, the part that had once trusted him with everything, wanted to hear what he had to say. "Fine," I said finally, my tone cold. 5 minutes. But don't think for a second I've forgiven you." We sat on the porch steps, an awkward silence stretching between us. John shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I screwed up," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I did, James. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand, I regret everything." I scoffed. "You regret it now? After you destroyed our family? After you betrayed me, your brother, for her?" "She left me," he blurted out, his face crumpling. "Beth left. Said she couldn't handle the fallout anymore." The words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it was quickly drowned out by anger. "Good," I said harshly. "You deserve each other." John winced but didn't argue. "I lost everything, James. Beth, the business, you. Mom won't even take my calls. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, I said flatly. There's no fixing what you did. He looked at me then, his eyes desperate. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I need to make things right. With you. With the girls. Please. At the mention of Sarah and Emily, my anger flared again. You think they want anything to do with you? I spat. They hate you, John. You're not their uncle anymore. You're the guy who helped destroy their family. I know, he said, his voice breaking. But they deserve to know that I'm sorry. That I didn't mean to hurt them. I shook my head, disgusted. This isn't about them. This is about you trying to ease your guilt. You don't get to make yourself feel better by dragging them into this. He didn't respond, just stared at the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his shame. For the first time, he looked less like the brother I hated and more like a broken man who had no idea how to put himself back together. I stood up, not wanting to feel anything close to pity for him. Your 5 minutes are up, I said, my tone icy. Don't come back. When I went back inside, Sarah was standing in the hallway, her arms crossed. She'd seen him through the window. What did he want? She asked, her tone clipped. To apologize, I said simply. She snorted. Too little, too late. Agreed, I said, resting a hand on her shoulder. He won't be coming back. She nodded but didn't look relieved. Good. As I watched her walk back to the living room, I realized just how much damage John's betrayal had done, not just to me but to my daughters. And no amount of apologies could ever undo that. A week after John's visit, I got a call I never expected. It was from Beth's lawyer, a curt, no-nonsense woman named Valerie who had handled our divorce. Seeing her name on my caller ID instantly made my stomach drop. Mr. Carson, she began, her tone professional. I'm calling regarding Beth. What about her? I asked sharply, already bracing for bad news. She's had a change in circumstances, Valerie said delicately. She's been hospitalized. It seems she had a breakdown of some sort. I felt a pang of shock, followed by an overwhelming mix of emotions I couldn't immediately sort out. Is she okay? She's stable now, Valerie replied. But she's unable to make decisions for herself at the moment. As her next of kin? I'm not her next of kin anymore, I cut in. We're divorced, remember? Yes, Valerie said patiently. But since she has no immediate family willing to step in? Wait, I interrupted again. What about John? Isn't he her immediate family now? There was a pause on the other end of the line. They're no longer in contact, she said finally. He's made it clear he wants nothing to do with this situation. Of course he did. Typical John, run when things get tough. What exactly are you asking me to do? I asked, my voice cold. She needs someone to handle her affairs temporarily, Valerie explained. Medical decisions, finances. It's not uncommon for an ex-spouse to step in during situations like this. I clenched my jaw. The last thing I wanted was to get dragged back into Beth's mess, but the thought of her being completely alone, with no one to advocate for her, as much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't just turn my back. I'll think about it, I said finally. But don't expect much. That evening, I sat the girls down once again. They were in the middle of a game of cards when I walked into the living room, and I could tell from their expressions that they knew something was up. What's wrong now? Sarah asked, setting her cards down. It's about your mom, I said, sitting on the edge of the couch. She's in the hospital. Both of them froze. Why? Emily asked, her voice trembling. She had some kind of breakdown, I explained, keeping my tone as gentle as possible. She's stable now, but she doesn't have anyone to help her. Sarah's face twisted in anger. So now you're supposed to swoop in and save her? After everything she did? It's not about saving her, I said firmly. It's about making sure she's okay, for your sake, not hers. I don't care if she's okay, Sarah snapped, standing up. She left us, Dad. She didn't care about us. Why should we care about her? Emily was silent, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. I reached for her, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know what to do, she whispered. She's still my mom, but it hurts so much. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she cried. I know, sweetheart, I murmured. I know. Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching us with a mixture of anger and sadness. Do whatever you want, she said finally. But don't expect me to forgive her. Later that night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the phone. Part of me wanted to call Valerie back and tell her to find someone else, anyone else. But another part, the part that still felt the weight of all those years together, couldn't shake the image of Beth alone and vulnerable. Against my better judgment, I picked up the phone and dialed. Valerie, I said when she answered. I'll do it. But this doesn't mean I'm forgiving her. Understood, she replied. I'll send over the paperwork. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of both dread and resolution. This wasn't about Beth anymore, it was about doing the right thing for the family we used to have, even if that family was shattered beyond repair. 2 days later, I found myself walking down the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the hospital. The air smelled of disinfectant and something faintly metallic, the kind of smell that makes your stomach turn. I hadn't seen Beth since the divorce was finalized, and the thought of facing her again filled me with a mix of anger and unease. A nurse escorted me to her room. She's awake, the nurse said softly. But just a heads up, she's still a bit fragile. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When I stepped into the room, I barely recognized her. Beth had always been so poised, so meticulous about her appearance. But the woman lying in the hospital bed looked small and frail, her hair limp and her eyes hollow. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment we just stared at each other. James, she said finally, her voice raspy. You came? Your lawyer called, I said stiffly, staying near the door. She said you needed someone to handle your affairs. Her face crumpled and she looked away. I didn't expect it to be you. Who else would it be? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. John? She winced at his name. He's gone, she said quietly. He left as soon as things got hard. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Shocking. Beth flinched at my tone but didn't argue. I'm sorry, James, she said, her voice breaking. For everything. For what I did to you. To the girls? Her words hung in the air but they felt hollow. I'd waited months to hear her say those things, and now that she had, they didn't bring the relief I thought they would. Sorry doesn't fix this, Beth, I said finally. It doesn't undo the damage. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't expect you to forgive me. I need you to know that I hate myself for what I did. I stood there, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to unleash all the anger I'd been holding on to make her feel the pain she'd caused. But looking at her now so broken, it just felt pointless. Why Beth? I asked finally. Why him? Why betray everything we built? She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't fully understand. I don't know, she admitted. I thought I was unhappy, but now I see what I had. And I threw it all away. The nurse interrupted then, stepping into the room to check Beth's vitals. I took the opportunity to step out, needing air. As I paced the hallway, I replayed our conversation in my mind. Her regret seemed genuine, but it didn't erase what she'd done. A part of me wanted to walk away and never look back, to let her deal with the consequences of her actions on her own. But another part, the part that still saw the mother of my children when I looked at her, felt compelled to stay. Not for her but for Sarah and Emily. I returned to the room after the nurse left. Beth looked up at me, her expression cautious, as though she expected me to lash out. I'll handle your affairs, I said finally. But this doesn't change anything between us. You're still responsible for making things right with the girls. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes again. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't respond. I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the sterile room. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen, her arms crossed. How was it? She asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. Did she tell you how sorry she is? She did, I said, setting my keys on the counter. But that's not for me to decide. It's for you and Emily. Sarah rolled her eyes. She doesn't deserve anything from us. That's your choice, I said calmly. But she's still your mom. No, Sarah snapped, her voice shaking. She's not. Moms don't do what she did. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled her into a hug even as she stiffened against me. I love you, Sarah, I said softly. And whatever happens, we'll get through it. Together. She didn't say anything, but after a moment, I felt her arms wrap around me. Beth's affairs weren't complicated, but handling them meant more hospital visits. Each time she tried to apologize or explain herself, but I kept it professional, focused on the task. She didn't press when she saw I wasn't engaging. At home, the tension was thick. Sarah avoided talking about Beth entirely, while Emily seemed torn. One evening, Emily finally spoke up. Do we have to see her? No, I said gently. Not unless you want to. It's your choice. Emily nodded, though she didn't look reassured. A week later, Beth's condition improved, and Valerie called to discuss long-term plans. Beth wanted to see the girls, but I wasn't sure they were ready. When I brought it up, Sarah immediately refused. She made her choice. I don't owe her anything. Emily was quieter but finally said, maybe? Just once. Okay, I said. No pressure. But if you do, I'll be there with you. A few days later, Emily decided she was ready. We went together to the hospital, her small hand gripping mine tightly as we walked into Beth's room. Beth's face lit up when she saw Emily, tears spilling over. "Hi, sweetie," Beth whispered. Emily hesitated, her lip quivering. "Why did you leave us?" she asked bluntly. Beth's expression crumbled. "I made terrible mistakes and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I love you, Emily. I always have." Emily looked at her for a long moment before quietly saying, "I don't know if I can forgive you." "That's okay," Beth said, her voice breaking. "Just hearing your voice means the world to me." On the way home, Emily was quiet. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. "She looked sad, Dad." "She is sad," I said. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry her pain." Emily nodded slowly and gave me a small hug before heading inside. That evening, Sarah cornered me in the kitchen. Her arms were crossed, her face flushed with anger. "You let Emily see her?" she snapped. "She wanted to," I said evenly. "I wasn't going to stop her." "She's manipulating you," Sarah said, her voice rising. "She doesn't care about us, Dad. She just wants to make herself feel better." "Maybe," I admitted. But Emily needed closure. "You don't have to see her, Sarah," but Emily made her own choice. Sarah shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You're letting her back in. After everything." "No," I said firmly, stepping closer. "I'm protecting both of you. This isn't about Beth. It's about what's best for you and your sister." Sarah hesitated, her defenses faltering. I don't want her to hurt Emily." "She won't," I promised. "I won't let her." Later, Sarah quietly joined me in the living room. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You don't have to apologize," I replied, pulling her into a hug. "It's okay to feel angry." As she leaned into me, I realized that healing for all of us was going to be a slow, uneven path. But we were taking steps forward, one at a time. A few days later, Sarah came into the kitchen holding an envelope. Her expression was guarded. "It's from Mom," she said, setting it on the counter. I froze. "Are you going to read it?" She shrugged. "I don't know." After a moment, she picked it up again and walked to her room. That evening, Sarah sat next to me on the couch, the letter in her hand. "She said she's sorry for everything," Sarah began. "That she knows she hurt us and she doesn't deserve another chance." I waited, letting her process. "She said leaving was the worst mistake of her life." Her voice cracked, but she quickly composed herself. "I don't know if I believe her, Dad. But I think she really means it." "You don't have to decide anything now," I said gently. "Take your time." Sarah nodded, clutching the letter tightly. "Maybe I'll write her back. Just to say how I feel." It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a step, a small crack in Sarah's walls. I didn't know what the future held for their relationship, but I felt a glimmer of hope that healing might someday be possible. 3 months after Beth's breakdown, Emily's birthday arrived. She had insisted on a small celebration, just the three of us. But the day before, she surprised me by saying she wanted to invite her mom. "Are you sure?" I asked, caught off guard. Emily nodded. "It feels right. Even if it's just this once." Sarah, however, was furious when she found out. "She doesn't get to waltz back into our lives like nothing happened," she said, her voice tight. "She's not waltzing in," I replied. "This is Emily's decision. I need you to respect it." Sarah crossed her arms, glaring at me. "Fine. But don't expect me to play nice." The next evening, Beth arrived just as we were lighting the candles on Emily's cake. I had warned her to keep things low-key, and to her credit, she looked more nervous than I'd ever seen her. "Hi, sweetie," she said softly when Emily opened the door. Emily hesitated before hugging her briefly. Beth's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her emotions in check. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. Sarah stayed in the kitchen, her expression cold. "You're late," she said flatly, not even looking at Beth. Beth faltered but didn't respond. Instead, she turned to me. "Thank you, James. I know this wasn't easy for you." "I'm here for the girls," I said simply. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." As we sat around the table, the mood was tense. Emily chatted nervously, trying to fill the awkward silences, while Sarah stayed silent, stabbing at her plate of cake. Finally, Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why are you even here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the room. "Sarah," I started, but Beth held up a hand. "It's okay," Beth said quietly. She turned to Sarah. "I'm here because Emily wanted me to be. But if you'd rather I leave, I will." Sarah scoffed. "You left us once already. Why stop now?" Emily's face fell, tears welling in her eyes. "Sarah, stop it," she said. "This was supposed to be a nice day." "Well, maybe it would have been if she wasn't here," Sarah shot back, standing up and storming out of the room. I found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. I sat beside her, waiting for her to speak. "It's not fair," she said finally, her voice breaking. "She broke everything, Dad. How can Emily just forgive her like that?" "She hasn't forgiven her," I said gently. "She's just trying to move forward in her own way. Maybe that's something you can think about, too." Sarah shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." "That's okay," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to. But don't let your anger stop you from enjoying your sister's birthday. Emily needs you." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come back." "For Emily?" When we returned to the house, Beth was quietly cleaning up in the kitchen while Emily opened her gifts. Sarah joined her sister, offering a tentative smile as Emily showed off her new art supplies. Beth caught my eye and gave me a small, grateful nod. She knew she didn't belong fully in this picture anymore, but for now she was content to stand on the edges, waiting to see if she'd ever be let back in. As I watched the girls laugh together, I felt a cautious sense of hope. We were far from healed, but maybe, just maybe, we were on the right path.